Welcome to the Whole Enchilada, a community of high achievers that fight the status quo, rebel against mediocrity, and make life happen. Let's go. Hello, Enchilada Nation. I'm super excited about the opportunity I have to be here today with a new friend of mine, former Navy SEAL operator. He spent time working with Blackwater, the CIA. He's a very well-known and sought-after motivational speaker, where it sounds like you do about 50 events a year. And that is a full schedule for a motivational speaker. I don't know how you keep the energy for that. But a lot of your top people I noticed on there that you've connected with: Boston Red Sox, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, Green Bay Packers, and the list goes on and on and on. I don't want to fail to mention your incredible podcast, Frog Logic, that I want to encourage my listeners to go check out.
Oh man, I think the biggest thing is that I'm a serial entrepreneur. Ever since I left the teams in 2003, I was in real estate and failed miserably at that. Right, my mom is a real successful realtor down here in Boca Raton, where I'm from. I tried security consulting, I tried mortgage marketing, I tried to start several other tech businesses, and failed miserably at most of them. But running Team Frog Logic was the thing that really made the most sense for me. And it suited the places where I have made the greatest investments in my life, which is really trying to understand the human condition. On top of that, I think I'm most proud of my faith. I'm a devout Christian, and then obviously my wife and my kids are monumental. And then the relationships I have and the people that I'm closest with, and actually it was through those relationships, the intimacy of those relationships with Dan and Chris and Derek and all the other instructors that were there. I mean, these are the people that really have moved and changed my life. And so, I think that's where I really like to, right? We're always measured by the company we keep. I mean, that's a great measurement of who we are. Great. And so when I'm able to surround myself with those types of individuals, and now hopefully you and I can develop a relationship too, man, it just lifts us up. It makes us better people. So I think that kind of rounds out my resume.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a great segue to where we can start our conversation today. Is you talk about the human condition and relationships. And it was interesting to me, like within the first several hours of this couple-day event, Dan turned the mic over to you, and you started talking about the importance of relationships. And then the next instructor was able to share some of his thoughts, and Chris brought up relationships. And so there was like this common theme. And it's interesting for me, is like, was that the common theme, or was that what I was ready to hear?
Oh, now you're talking, brother.
Right. And so it's really interesting to hear, was that what everyone else was picking up, or was it just like in that moment, that's what I needed to hear, is relationship. And it spun in my mind until later that night. We were all, after a day shooting, hanging out, we were all hanging out. And I remember people were talking, and I voiced up and I said, you guys keep talking about the importance of relationships. Like, what does that mean? How do we do that? And you pull the classic trick that I pull on people all the time, is you turn to me and you say, well, Marcus, what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
Right. And I fumbled through an answer on the spot, and this, that, and the other. And I was like, okay, I'm not making sense. I'm going to turn this back on him. And I turned back to you. Well, David, what does it mean to you? And your answer was so much better than mine and unexpected. And it was intimacy.
Amen.
Right. And it was that, coupled with us talking about shooting, of the whole concept between aim small, miss small, all the little pieces of shooting that can be applied to life. Those two things came together. And the next day, you and I were on the same shooting range, and I clicked for me, and I looked at you and I said, David, this is it. It's intimacy with accuracy is going to take the relationships that I need to the next level. And that's what I want to talk about today is one, the misconception around intimacy. I thought you touched on it beautifully. I want to talk about that.
I think you couldn't have framed out this show in a better way, man. Thank you so much for that intro. It's always challenging for I guess men in general, but in particular for a former Navy SEAL and CIA contractor to be in front of we had two females that were part of it, but the rest of everybody were males, and to open my mouth and utter those words of the critical nature of intimacy. as a real defining character trait of relationships. And if you had asked me that when I got out of the teams, when I was, a 32-year-old crazed, a young guy driving my motorcycle 100 miles an hour down I-95 and riding it through bars and knocking people out on a whim, and that type of stuff. It was mostly because I didn't have an intimate relationship with myself or with God, and I didn't really understand how to translate the profound intimacy that I did experience in the teams into a civilian life. And it took me, I'd say the better part of a decade to really kind of come to that fruition where it is intimacy first, that, I need to be able to understand what that is and be okay with it. And then the other is then, like you said, how do we effectively apply it to the people that are coming in and out of our lives? In particular, the people that have the greatest impact, the people that are foundational, right? The people that represent the cornerstones of how we conduct ourselves.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think that's in line. You and I talked briefly before we started recording about how a lot of times, and I think a lot of our followers are entrepreneurs as well, and they have an obligation to a lot of people. And I think sometimes our relationships become neutral or numb a little bit because we're trying to divide our attention and energy up equally among all these people. And in essence, we never hit that intimate status with any of them, right? Or the ones that really deserve it, somehow we don't have the energy to like really apply it or the know-how. And so I love that you gave the background there, that it wasn't something that you've always recognized as the importance of intimacy, because, sit there asking a former Navy SEAL, CIA operative about relationships and hearing the word intimate, you would think like, wait, what a second. Wait, that wasn't what I was expecting. But I think that's why it hit me so solid, is like, okay, here's someone that obviously is someone that I could look up to, resonate with, a warrior. And he has the gumption to say, hey, it's about this. Is it okay for me to put down my tough guy shield and say, hey, I can accept that too? So what was that moment for you where you kind of went from recognize like, okay, and I love that you brought up self-intimacy first, right? Self-intimacy. I think you almost have to start there before you can build intimacy with anybody else.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I was a Division I athlete in college and was surrounded by a bunch of great guys, really close friends. I'm still friends with several of the guys that I played with still to this day. That's 30-year relationships that are still there. But it really didn't manifest itself into the real extent of what intimacy means until I got into the teams. And then I got further into the teams, going through training, making it through Hell Week. I mean, my boat crew in Hell Week, I mean, these are, 6 other guys that went through one of the worst long evolution experiences of my mind. But we were so in tune with making sure each other was being satiated in our misery, in our pain. And that was like the first time I started going, whoa, all right, there's this whole thing of intimacy is much deeper, much more intense than I imagined, right? And I had really 1 or 2 relationships from a romantic relationship in my life, and I'd had good friendships, but nothing like these were evolving, and it really was impactful. But fast forward, I get out, and it was like, 1 minute I'm going 1,000 miles an hour, and the next minute I'm a 32-year-old guy living at home with my parents. I'm $10,000 in debt. I got no real job opportunities in front of me, and I had a sense of almost, I wouldn't call it quite hopelessness, but there was certainly a weight that was placed onto me through the lack of identity, right? Because my identity now is no longer a construct of this Navy SEAL personality that I had evolved into. And so that really began this process. And for me, I always believe the first step was really coming to the recognition that, all right, the men I worked with overseas, in particular, when I went, I did 1 combat deployment in the teams, and that was it. The men in that scenario, they were willing to die for me. And that's first time I'd ever really felt that, right? You kind of don't really feel it with your parents. I mean, they'll do anything, but you can't contemplate the magnitude of what a parent will really do for a child. Child just doesn't have that perception.
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden I'm looking across from these men that, would take a bullet for me, that would get blown up for me, that would do all these things. And so I'm like, wow, that's intense. That's a real intense thing. And it was kind of in that deployment was the first time where I actually ever really started to pray. I'm like, all right, if there's God, man, the old adage that adage that there's no atheists in foxholes, that's some true shit right there, brother. That is some true stuff right there. And I experienced that, and for the first time started to recognize, all right, I'm gonna try this whole thing out. If there's a God, I'm gonna pray. And then when I got out, man, I caved in. And so for 3 years, I really kind of had a self-loathing. I was very self-destructive in many different ways with my behaviors, with my relationships. I'd been engaged, getting out, that decimated quickly. And I came to realize that I was woefully ill prepared to have a relationship with myself, because at that time I didn't even know what that was. And so fast forward, I said, all right, once I came to kind of this awakening, all right, and it was actually through a couple friends of mine had asked me to marry them. And it was the first wedding that I'd ever been asked to do. I've since did my 14th last year or something like that. So
wow.
Reverend Rut is a real thing. Just reach out on the website if you want me to marry you, right? But anyways, that was the big transition for me, because here I was going to stand in front of God and these people's families, and I was going to somehow conjure up the intensity of the ultimate intimacy, which is getting married, right? And having a life partner that you share the totality of this experience with till the end of your days, until death do us part. And then if you have faith, and even beyond that. And I was not prepared for that. And so that was the real cataclysmic shift for me that said, all right, how am I going to do that? And my old headmaster from the school I grew up going to down here called St. Andrews, Reverend Andrews, thank you. But he was a reverend. And for the first time he was still at the school. I went back and went to church, and it was teeny little side chapel. And I go in there, and he looks up, he sees me in the front row, and he got this big smile on my face. And afterwards, and I went up to him and I said, George, I've come through this. I've done all this, I want to get to know God, and I don't know what to do. He was the first person that said, hey, why don't you just go try reading? He gave me a couple verses to go check out in Matthew and some other books in the New Testament. And he said, start there. And so I went in, and all these things just said, love thyself, right? Love thyself as you love your neighbor, or God loves me intensely. Christ loves me. Christ loves the children. You love children around you, love the people. And here's this word, this overt word that has the substantiality of omnipotence attached to it, right? This godlike presence within this intimacy. And yet I had never allowed myself to contemplate existence in that format. And that was the catalyst which began another decade of figuring this out, really.
Yeah. And I think it's such an important, relevant message, because the world is so noisy. And the truth is, if I walked down to the local grocery store and I stood out front and I asked people to define intimacy, probably 99 out of 100 of them would equate that to some element of sex, right? Some element
100%.
of that type of relationship.
Dictionary.com, there's always right here an act of an expression serving as a token of familiar affection and the like. And then here it is, number 6, sexual intercourse.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's the derivative that we are rooted in, is that intimacy is sex, and it's the furthest thing from the truth.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, since I had that defining moment a few weeks ago, this has been part of my personal study, is to better understand what is intimacy, what does that look like, so that I can.
What'd you find out so far? Come
yeah,
on, man.
I'm gonna
some knowledge, brother.
I'm gonna share.
Good.
So some of that is I had to understand the word beyond the public perception of it, right? The public definition of it before I could say, okay, I better understand what it is. Now, how do I accurately apply it to the relationships that are most key, right? And a couple things that stuck out to me was, in Proverbs, it defines intimacy, close familiarity or friendship. Nothing to do with the sexual relationship. It's just being a close and as familiar as you can with somebody, right?
Knowing.
Yeah, exactly. And knowing them, a closeness between people and personal relationships. And then I really like this quote where it says, A+ intimacy boils down to connection and attention. So do you connect, and are you giving it the proper amount of attention? And if you think about that, the two first relationships you brought up was self and God. And I almost think you need to make those connections intimately before you can properly give intimacy to any other relationship. Would you agree with that? What are your thoughts on that?
100%. No, I 100% agree. That's where it begins. I mean, how often do we see people on a regular basis that we know they're not in a healthy space with themselves, right? We run into it day in and day out, especially if you're in charge of a company and you're having to manage people. You're every day you're getting people who are coming in and they're going through a divorce. They're coming in, they're going through a sickness. They're going in, they just lost a parent, or their kids are challenging to them, or they have whatever it might be. Especially, you look at the last year and a half plus where we were all thrust into this isolation. So all of the intimacy that we once had was either, external intimacy was locked down. And so we were forced to evaluate ourselves. And what happened? We have mental health issues that are shooting through the roof because in those moments where you can't leave or it's forced introspection, right? And so when you have time and opportunity to really dig in to deconstruct your life, if you will, you start to recognize, man, my relationships are not intimate in nature. How I look at myself is not intimate. I'm not really honest with myself. And so I think the root cause or what's really intimacy is truly imbued with is the sensation of honesty, right? And that was the awakening for me, right? When I finally accepted and took that big leap and said, you know what? God knows me. God created me, so God knows all of me. And within that relationship, if God knows me and he served up his son so I could know his son and to better know God and to better know myself, man, that's where I'm going to start. And so you start asking yourself the real questions, what is my belief system? What is the morality by which I will hold myself accountable? What are the virtues that I will remain steadfast against the malevolence of the human experience, man? And I go back, man, from early on, my father was a real intellectual guy, and and he essentially was always like, David, you got to ask these questions in your life: is who am I and why am I here? And if you're not asking yourself those questions, then you're kind of randomly going on throughout life. You're not setting forth the potential that you could achieve in any real consequential way. You're just letting the external influences drive your direction. And really the intimacy is where that begins, I believe.
No, I love that. I love that analogy too, of that reality conversation of yourself. And I think as a human species, we have this warped sense of the word reality too, ever since reality TV came out right now, that which it couldn't be farther from reality. And I think once we start digging internally to ask ourselves that question, I think a lot of us have built this fortress around who we really are to protect ourselves. Because some of those conversations are uncomfortable. Even though they're happening between your ears, a lot of times those are uncomfortable conversations. So we've built this fortress around it. And even when we go in to find out for ourselves, we hit that fortress we built for ourselves and be like, oh yeah, I built that for a reason. And then we don't want to get in there. And I think that's such a critical piece for us to strip that down to say, well, who am I really? Like when I show up, is that because of someone else's expectation that I show up that way? Or is that inherently who I am and driven from the true values that are inherently in me?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, right? I mean, we need the defensive posturing for sure. We need our armor. We always have to have armor because the world is such a difficult and place of struggle, right? Suffering and pain is a perpetually present in our life, and so we're gonna have that. That's why I think the brilliance of your commentary about the accuracy of intimacy is so perfect. I mean, if you really want to understand the human condition, just look at the history of mythology, right? Look at all the stories that have been cultivated throughout cultures across every different continent, every different group. They're very similar. Carl Jung did incredible work on all of that for years after he said, I think Freud has some theories about, some ideas, but I think our subconscious is a derivative of the stories that we kind of are exposed to from early on, right? When we first start hearing the tales from our family or the tales from friends, or now, unfortunately, our children are being completely inundated with the millions of stories and sub stories and images and narratives that they're just being bombarded with. There's a detachment from that slow story, the story which is the crucial personality components that makes you who you are. So yeah, we do have to have an armor to protect ourselves, for sure. And depending upon how you were raised and where you were raised and what you experienced, that armor's thick or not so thick or whatever. And you certainly build it up in different places more than others, right? The targeted accuracy of intimacy is critical. Now, the question becomes, where do we start? What is the first and most accurate place we need to start with what intimacy is, right? And I think that's intensely debatable.
Yeah.
Well, now I got to get you on my show, dude.
I'd be honored to be on your show. And I want to encourage all of our listeners here, go check out Frog Logic. The message there is very much in alignment with the whole enchilada. Go think through those relationships, and don't forget, go live life on your terms.